Jeff, your family has lived here in Toolangi for 6 generations. Can you tell us about your family coming here and what brought them to Toolangi and where they first settled?
Yeah, well, I'm the 4th generation here. My great-grandfather came here in the early 1890s with his wife and half their family. There was, I think it was 3 or 4 children. They expanded to 7 kids. And they lived just down next door, half a k away in the bordering property below us. I'm not sure whether there was a house already there, but I think they built one. It was beside the creek, and they had a water race that came down past the house to get water. That was the end of the old Chum Creek Road. There was no school in Toolangi in those days, so some other locals built the first school for my grandfather to go to school. There's still a core of probably 4 or 5 families here today of my generation, younger, that are from those original families from that day. My grandfather went to school here, and he helped him and his brothers helped clear the rest of the farm over there, and then he bought this farm here where we are today here, this block. His brother bought one over the others behind us over on the farm there, and another brother over the other side on Smiths Road. And then he had a sister living just over the back over here as well. The other sisters and the other younger brother went down the line and lived as they grew up. So it was timber working or farm work that they had to work on in those days, and if it was all walk or horse and dray or walk, Dad says he can remember going up to, it was Saturday morning, going to meet his father coming out of the bush, because he was a bush faller, and they'd camp at the mills during the week. The mills all had like communities there, huts for the workers and the bush workers. He'd walk down out of the bush for Saturday morning, come home and have a bath, and then walk off to cricket in the afternoon in the summer. So
Terrific.
if you didn't like walking, you were a bit stuffed in those days, because there wasn't too many that had a car. Even in the early 1910s, there was only just 1 or 2 up here that had a car. So it was horse and dray and walking.
Yeah.
So that's.
And what are your memories of what you've been told, Heather?
Yeah, haven't had much information about my great-grandparents, other than knowing that they were the ones who came here to settle and they lived over there. Know a bit more about my grandfather. I know he was a really hard worker, but grew potatoes, worked up in the bush, Murrindindi mills and all those ones up the bush up there. Walked miles. He was as thin as a beanpole, and no wonder. But like he'd come home and go and, like as Jeffrey said, from working up the mill all week, he would walk from Toolangi to Dixon's Creek or Yarra Glen or Healesville to play cricket all afternoon, and then walk home again. So you had to be fit. I mean, you can't imagine
Coming up the mountain.
doing that. Yeah. They just walked everywhere. I don't remember that he ever rode a horse or had a horse and dray or whatever. He just walked everywhere. My grandmother apparently did a bit of bush, a bit of walking, and as well she is an immigrant from the UK, from London in the 1920s.
No, earlier than that.
Earlier, was it? Her brother had a land selection up Spraggs Road, and she came to him or visited him, and that's where she met my grandfather. And she adapted to country life and whatever and that sort of thing. They lived a very frugal, different way of life to what we do. We have very few photographs or heirlooms or memorabilia, because my grandparents' place got totally burnt down in the bushfires in 1939. The only thing saved was the Toolangi Cricket Cup, which my grandfather threw out the window, and apparently my grandmother actually hid some quite special linen in a culvert. That were the only things that got saved. Everything else just got totally burnt. So we ourselves, we've only gathered a few things from more distant family and things. So that's kind of my recollections of it all. Yeah.
And Jeff, can you give us some idea of this from the stories your parents and grandparents would have told? what life was like for them back here.
Well, life in the early 1900s and the 20s, and then of course you got the Depression in the 30s, was subsistence living in most cases. If you get enough money to eat and to raise your family, there was no going on holidays and buying this or buying that like today. It was a lot, and any spare money, I suppose, as farmers, they try to develop their farm slowly, but it was a lot different. Yeah, we didn't get power on Toolangi until 1963, so on that basis, life was different. Everybody was tank water, and still is basically tank water, or from creeks up here. So we haven't got town water. You didn't have everybody had an outside toilet. The pub was probably a little bit different. As we grew up as kids, up there we lived right opposite the hotel. We didn't visit it, frequent it, nor did our parents, but they had some friends that used to come and help with the providers of the hotel, and they had kids, and we'd go over there and play with the kids that came there. But it was in the 50s and early 60s, the hotel was very well run. They had a lot of guests used to come there, weekends there, but they had a lighting plant there, so they were one of the few that had power. There's a lighting plant in the bore. And
that was a diesel generated lighting plant, wasn't it?
Yes, one lug engine, all this stuff. And there was probably half a dozen families up here that had lighting plants. The pub was one, and you used to see the old George Richards Ackham, as they call him. He'd wander off with his lantern late at night, go down and switch the generator off or the motor off, and you'd see the lantern dangling back up late, midnight or whatever. In '63 we got the power on, so life changed then. You could sit up later at night and read books, paper, then TV started to come, so in-house entertainment became the thing, and life changed that way.
So, Heather, can you give us some idea from any stories your mum and dad told, or your grandparents, of what life was back in the day and how it changed?
It was a very, very simple way of life. They kind of seemed to be content with what they had. It was, and they didn't seem to mind the manual work. They were supposed to knew nothing else. Everything was manual, basically. I remember Dad doing the farm work with the draft horses, pulling the sled behind the horses to cart the bag of potatoes and things. Planting, my grandfather throwing out the seed potato out of a bag around his neck, and planting that way. The plough came along, and the harrows and things all done by horse and implement. They snigged. My grandfather and my father cleared a lot of the bush here after Dad came back from the war, all by axe and crosscut saw. Snigged the logs with the horse.
And life for your mother and grandmother at home, running things in the house would have been very different too.
Very, very different. Well, the base, I suppose the centre of the home, like most places, was the wood stove. You had your wood stove, and so it was always important to have the firewood and cook on the wood stove. The washing was all done by hand and in a hand washing, and hung out in the line, all that sort of thing.
Copper.
No hot water. We just, I don't know what they did. I suppose, my grandparents' era was, they just boiled up big pots of water, I suppose. We, at least to have a bath, we had a chip heater, a wood chip heater that you'd fire up and get your hot water for your bath once a week. Just all those sorts of things. Nothing, the everyday life, I suppose, basics just took a lot longer because you had to do everything manually, but that was all you knew. That was just your way of life. Preserving, all that sort of thing was just part of living. You just didn't have all the...
And preserving, growing fruit and growing vegetables and preserving.
Right. Yeah. It's more the fruit, I suppose. We didn't have many fruit trees, but we had some. But they'd buy in big cases of fruit and bottle them for the season. All that sort of thing. You could get fresh bread and meat sent up on the mailman, with the mailman.
How often?
Every day.
You could get it any
Every day.
He came up
you
5
could if
days
you,
a week.
yeah. I mean, I think you paid so much, you know, and you'd send your order down. I know my mum had a little Hessian sugar bag thing that she used to roll up with her meat order in it. She'd send it down one day, the mailman would take it to the butcher's Christie's in Hillsville. They then, the next day, send back the sugar bag full of your chops and your sausages and all these things.
Wonderful.
Same with the bread, you'd have the baker would send the bread out, and that was usually a set order, I suppose. And the greatest enjoyment was going down to the mailbox to pick up the fresh bread and pinching the fresh bread out of the front of the loaf. That was just natural, like in your mail, which the mail, you know, they picked up and took each day. You relied on your mail. You didn't have the phone.
And you brought your milk in?
The milk, no. We did. We didn't have a house cow. Dad's cousins, Tom and Jack Biggs, who lived over on Smiths Road, they ran dairy cows, and so they had a bit of a small milk run. They had great big gel buckets that they used to put it in. And
so you'd go and get your milk?
No, I think Tom he had a delivery every day and would come out with the milk to various people in Toolangi.
Drop-off points.
Yeah, and they also sold eggs. They used to have eggs. We had our own chooks, but yeah, so our milk, we had fresh milk all the time because we could get it easily from them. But other than that, you know, things were very different. Shopping was very different. You did your shopping in Hillsville. They always had. That's where my parents, who Mum got to know her mother-in-law while Dad was away in the army, and she encouraged the relationship, and that's by going to Hillsville to do the shopping. That's where my grandmother, you know, got to know my mum, and the people in Toolangi went to Hillsville generally to do all their shopping.
Right.
So yeah, there was a store down opposite the state primary school in Toolangi. I vaguely remember going there with Dad.
Down near the present school?
Yes, opposite.
Yeah.
The old
Opposite,
building was
yeah.
was opposite the present school.
In Cherry Lane?
Yeah. And then the Kelly
Moved round the
family
corner.
came and bought that and then built the new shop, and that was a great event. The opening of the new shop. And
what year was that?
Late 50s.
Late 50s.
yeah, and they had a
Mid to late 50s, yeah.
the old manual petrol pump.
Yeah.
It was the first time you could buy fuel at the pump in Toolangi, and they had the telephone exchange, you know, with the old manual exchange until the new one opened. They built that. And to be able to go to a shop and buy your lollies and stuff every now and then, and like, yeah, I remember Mum used to put an order through to Mrs. Kelly and get the basics of, you know, biscuits and all that, flour and stuff.
Biscuits in tins?
Yes.
Yes, biscuits in tins.
They
yes.
lift down the tins and put them in paper bags for you.
Yeah, all that. So it was a real convenience when Kelly's store opened. Yeah, for things that just those extras that you needed.
Now, Jeff, can you tell us about your mum and dad and their involvement in the community? Because I know they were involved with the church and different things.
Involved with, the parents were both involved with the church. Dad was a steward on the local circuit, the administration side of it. He was obviously a member of the school council here. And of course he was in his business area. Besides being a farmer, he took on being a fuel distributor, fuel agent in the early 60s.
Yeah.
So he got around the district. And one of his other, employment jobs, he used to change the records daily for the seismic observatory, both the magnetic observatory, and then from the early 60s through to the late 1990, the seismic. And that probably ruled his life more than ours. But as kids, if you were going anywhere, you couldn't go anywhere before 10 o'clock in the morning because the magnetic observatory had to be changed at 10 o'clock a.m. every morning, which was 0 Greenwich time, world time. And the seismic was a bit different because he could vary that 2 hours either way of a day. So and he done that for about 50 years. He was involved with the magnetic and then the seismic observatory. on that basis. On that, there. Yeah, Mum was involved with the school and the church community and CWA and the like. So.
And Heather, what can you remember of your parents' involvement in the community? What stands out?
I think probably the biggest involvement for the whole family, the Biggs family point of view, was the church connection with what was back then was the Methodist Church, which, like Jeffrey said, a great-grandfather was involved in building the initial church building.
What was the church called? Did it have a saint something?
No, it was just
Methodist Church.
It was a Methodist church.
Yeah.
And my grandmother in particular was she was very involved in it, very instrumental in running Sunday school and all those sorts of things. The Biggs family and the Blackmore family were the ones who were the stalwarts of the Toolangi Church. And yeah, my grandmother used to hold a church fete every year to raise funds for the church, and that was usually held in the old Toolangi Hall, which was the old school building, which became the Toolangi Hall. She used to hold it in there every year. It was quite an annual event for her. She used to go around getting all sorts of donations and things, and for the church fete, raise funds. And then my mum took over, helping with Sunday school, those sorts of things, kept it going for a long time. It was every second Sunday afternoon, because it was all part of the Healesville circuit of churches. The minister would do the church services in Healesville in the morning, then he would go either to Dixons Creek, Badger Creek or Toolangi in the Sunday afternoon. So it was only, Toolangi was every second week. And, so it was that was kind of a big part of our family activities.
And church picnics?
Well, we didn't in our age group. We didn't. I think that was more the social type of activity that happened in my grandparents and dad's young age. They had that was, I think, as a community wise back then, they did have a lot more of those social gatherings than what we did, because by the time we were young, there were cars that would transport you, go do other things. There was probably more community sport and things. Back then, those sort of gatherings were quite a way for people to get together, have a bit of a social outlet.
Within the community, that's right.
Yeah.
Because by the time the Second World War changed things.
Yes.
This is after the soldiers returned, things started to progress, and as we are as baby boomers, things boomed ahead, and cars, people were able to afford a motor car and transport, and you wanted further, and yes, things changed, life changed.
Yeah. So, that's great. So that gets us to you, and Jeff, what was it like growing up in the 50s and 60s as a child and a teenager? Games, playing, sport, leisure, recreation, socialising?
Plenty of room to wander around on a farm, Toolangi and bush. Mixed with a few friends around the district. One or two still went on and stayed, lived in the place still here today. Used to, I suppose, as a teenager, wandered around on push bikes a bit, explored the place around. And as I got older, as a teenager, helped my father work on the farm. That was part of life. Chores and working on the farm, helping to dig spuds and the likes.
And sport?
Sport, I played cricket for a few years, but then I started business of my own, and that took precedence, so I gave away sport. And so I started working for myself from 19, so
And primary school?
Yeah, both Heather and I went to primary school up here. It was about 36 kids in the 50s and 60s those days. In the 30s, and a good number of them are still around. I won't say in Toolangi, but within the vicinity, Healesville and around. Yeah, we still know of and mix with.
And some favourite teachers or?
Favourite teachers?
Yeah.
No, I wouldn't say so. Not that I got on with them all right, but no, I can't say there's a favourite.
And finally, getting off to secondary school, you went down to Healesville?
Yeah, well, we were lucky then because previous Hillsville High School actually started in '61,
That's right.
but the new building there didn't open till 62 or
62.
yeah. And that was my first year at high school was the new building, and there was a bus started here in '61 which was taking the kids to Hillsville.
Mackenzie's. Yeah.
Previous to that, if you wanted to go do anything past year 8, you had to ride a bike over to Castella. There was a bus came through to Gordon's Bridge to get into Yea, or you rode to Hills and went on the train.
So some kids
Ludall.
actually went to secondary school in Yea.
Yes, yes, yes. But neighbours, 2 eldest boys, McPherson's, Clive and Ian, they rode their bikes to Hills and went to Ludall High School.
Right.
So from the early '60s on, we had a bus service to Hills at the high school.
That's a long bike ride down to Hillsville.
It's a long
And then a
one
bus, a long way home up that mountain.
Yeah. Well, I had an apprenticeship as a motor mechanic, and I rode a push bike for 3 years to Hillsville. I never rode home too many times all the way home. Father used to pick me up about halfway, or something a little bit less, and I'd come home and help him cart in spuds and do things. So we had a bit of a mutual agreement, work both ways.
So Heather, your memories of growing up in Toolangi in 50s and 60s, like friendship groups, playing, the kind of playing that you did then, sports, leisure, recreation, sport, primary school, yeah?
I clearly remember primary school. I went to Toolangi Primary. That when I started was still all classes, all grades were all in one room in the old schoolroom. Open fire was the only heating. And I remember the second building being built and all of that. Yeah, it was quite enjoyed the time there. Was really quite a close community as a school.
They put a warmery in, and you could eat your sandwiches up and have toasted sandwiches on top of the warmery in the winter.
At the school?
At the school,
yeah. One day, yeah.
Gruyere did them.
But yeah, it was good. But so obviously it was a great culture shock from my point of view, going to the secondary school in Hillsville, catching a bus, going to the bigger school and everything was quite daunting.
All those kids.
Yeah. But that was what you did. It was a long day. You'd go off and catch the bus in the morning, get back at about 4:45 in the evening. That was So I wasn't involved in any sports at all. My mum cared for her parents, or mother in particular, who had health problems, and so every Saturday we used to go down and she'd do all her mum's housework and things. So I was never around at the weekends and never had an inclination to get involved. Tennis was always a big thing in the community up here, so I was never involved in all that. My desire had always been to have a horse, but never got one, so I really wasn't into sports. And from the point of view of friends, because of there was no close by neighbours. I think Doug McPherson was probably the only one I'd played with at times at school holidays and things, and we were just over the back, and at times he'd come out and call out, and we'd go and meet and play together. And there weren't any other girls nearby. So and just from the farm point of view, it was all very much the delineation of duties and roles that I never learnt to drive the tractor or any of those things. Jeffrey went off and did that as the boy on the farm, and I probably stayed around the house, did chores and stuff with mum and all that sort of thing.
But the expectation was that you'd work and help and pull the weight in the family
we
as
part
well.
of what went on. You
Absolutely.
help with feeding the chooks and all those sorts of things, and that was all just part of life. We didn't have big expectations. You didn't go out and do activities and things, and
And when friends around that we went to school with, they had the same. They had to help at home too, and help in the spuds and this, that, and the other. Yeah, it was, yeah.
Now, Jeff, given that the highway wasn't built until the 1970s...
65 actually.
Sorry?
65.
65.
I remember riding a push bike up there when it was just formed.
And when did they get the tar on it?
I think it was 65 or 6 it opened.
66. Yeah, okay.
Either 65 or 66 it got opened.
Ah,
It didn't go right through
how far did it
to
go?
Glenburn. It took a little bit longer before that rope ended up got finished right
so
through.
it came to the top of the side.
Came to the top for a start, and then they kept
and
on
you
doing
turned
the rest.
right and went along to Gordonsbridge Road.
You either turned left and went up to Kinglake or Talangi, and then wasn't a great length of time. They finished it, they opened it up right through to down to Gordonsbridge to Kinglake.
Okay.
To Glenburn, sorry.
Yeah. Just on what you've told us so far, I'm wondering if there are any funny stories or anecdotes you can share.
Yeah, there possibly is one or two. Some of possibly they're not repeatable from around the district, but a couple of family ones there. One in the early days, my grandfather growing up as a young fellow with his father had to make up, had a cow or two, raising a few cattle down below. So they made up a stockyard race, and they were going to brand them. And the old fella had one of his sons. They made up a brand, got a fire going. And they come charging out, whacked it on the hindquarters of the animal. Of course, it's burnt it. And the old boy was standing behind, got kicked in the guts, sent him flying. His sons thought that was a huge joke. But he was a big man. The difference is, I suppose, from today, that my grandfather found it hard to fathom at times, was when he grew up as a kid, his father grew a few spuds, used to market them in Hillsville to the fruit shops and the guest houses. He'd sledge them on a horse and sledge, 8 to 10 bags, that was 65 kilo bags, to halfway down to Chum Creek.
Pulled by a horse.
Pulled by a horse. He kept a dray down at the post office. There was a post office at Heath Road at Chum Creek. He kept a dray there. He transferred the bags off the sledge to the dray, and there was an old gravel road from there into Hillsville, and then he'd go in and do a market. He tipped the dray over on the road because it was not like a road we know today. It was a gravel or bog holes. The dray finished in a hole and tipped over. He finished up underneath the spuds, and he had to lift it off himself to get out, lift it back and keep going. And he lifted off himself and became strained his eyes and got blind in one eye after that.
10 bags, 65 kilos,
bags, yeah.
650 kilos and the weight of the dray.
Yeah, yeah. So he was a big, strong man. He did a bit of fencing as well, and so he was.
It's amazing.
He'd been a brickmaker in Melbourne and used to help ladle bricks, and no elevators in those days. You walked up a ladder with a ladle with a dozen bricks on your shoulder. Yeah. So he was good for strength. And of course, my grandfather grew up. Was all axe and crosscut saws in the bushes, and then we got chainsaws and later life, and you could cut down in 15 minutes. You'd cut a big tree down, where they'd taken an hour or more, hour and a half to scarf it with an axe and then a crosscut saw. I can still just remember my father and him with the crosscut saws. They taught me how to use one of them.
That's amazing.
And I mentioned earlier about Dad doing the caretaker and also the job of changing the records daily for the Seismic Observatory, and that recorded earthquakes or movements in the earth, earthquakes and tremors and the likes all around the world. There was 6 recorders, 3 were local in Asia and Australia, and 3 overseas.
And these were government stations?
These were government stations, and it was 7 days a week, all weather. And there a couple of times there, it was 3 mile away near the Spud farm. He had to go out on a tractor. He was coming back one morning on the tractor. It was snow, and we used to have a few pulp cutters that camped in the bush, and it was they were frequent to the pub, and it was a bit wet and cold for them to be cutting out in the bush. Anyway, they must have been hungover from the night before, because they ran into the back of Dad on the tractor as he was coming back home. and lo and behold, one of the sons I ran into just 18 months ago, he was a builder. He was up here on my son's house, and he said, I've been to Talangi. When I was a kid, I came here with my father. He used to come over to the pub. He said he was a timber cutter. I said, oh yeah, and Nick called himself his Woody, and I said, your father wouldn't have been old Woody. We had a mate called Nobby. Yes, I said, well, I know all about those too. He said, yeah, that'd be them. So that was, yes, it's a small world sometimes.
Some real characters.
Yes.
Can I ask you, Heather, can you tell us about some important community celebrations? And so that went on in Talangi that might have been associated with the school or the church or?
The biggest event, I think, to me, as a young child or younger person, was when the electricity got connected. That was a huge event in our own
Celebration?
lives.
Yeah.
In our own lives, as well as a celebration in
hall.
the community. They had a switch-on ball, and we didn't go to that. But I remember, I think it was winter time when it was switched on.
Yep.
It was,
Wow.
and all the house had been wired and the lights fitted and everything for a couple of weeks. At this particular day when it was going to be switched on, the SEC inspector had to come around and do each house or whatever, and it was evening by the time we got to our place, and it was just transforming. You know, on went the lights, the power and the light switch with the fluorescent light, and we could put out the old kerosene lamps. You know,
Wow.
It was just.
What year?
That was in
1963.
63.
63.
Yeah,
That's
it was, and it
amazing.
was just transforming. Prior to that, we had no refrigeration. Well, the refrigeration was kerosene fridge, kerosene lamps, methylated spirits
58
iron.
years ago.
Yeah. Or Mum used the flat irons or the kerosene iron.
Yeah.
You had no mixer, any of that. Everything, all household chores were manual. Yeah, so that was, to me, that was a really big transfer, and the whole community, yes, and it was a real community spirit thing that the the community had to put in money to get it to happen.
Yeah.
They had to put in so much, and then the government put in so much. So yeah, it was a real big event in the whole of Talangi.
That's terrific.
And other than that, I think the centenary for C.J. Dennis, that was a bit of a thing. I don't remember a lot of it, but that was
what year?
something. Oh. Look, I'm not sure.
No,
I think it was in the 70s, actually.
Yeah.
I think
70s.
So that was... but, yeah, I think the school concerts, there's two in particular that stand out in my mind, of the school concert that we held in the C.J. Dennis Hall.
Yeah.
That was always a big event.
Terrific.
But, yeah, I think the electricity we had probably had, because it had such an impact community-wise and
Biggest thing.
lifestyle-wise,
Wow.
it was a huge event. And to get just to get all those conveniences, I suppose, and it transformed, you know, how you lived in lots of ways.
And the community
freezers.
The community did celebrate 100 years of the Talangi State School in '95.
That's right.
That was a community event. We celebrated. We got old students who were still alive, and old teachers came back. That was a big event, and all my kids were going there then, and it was. It was, I suppose, strange for them to see that their parents had been here, and other older people around, their grandparents had been to school and the likes. Yeah.
And Heather had mentioned the annual concert at the school. Was that a big thing for the community?
It was. And all those, especially connected with the school. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah.
It brought everybody into the hall.
Yes.
Yes, even though older people didn't have, like, was grandparents, but just people generally in the community. The McLean family, Nancy and her mother-in-law and Norma McLean, particularly, I think they were the ones who did a lot of the sewing, made all these costumes, made up the music, you know, taught us all how to do it, and they had a huge input.
And Claire Cherry.
Yeah, that's right, Claire Cherry.
Heather
and
Clemence's mother.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was like a community thing. I think we weren't involved in it, but the tennis and cricket side of things was a very big community thing in Talangi, but we weren't really involved in that.
And
In the
are there
60s and 70s, I think it was 6 or 7 tennis teams they had.
Gosh.
And quite good, strong teams. They were,
Yeah.
And
That's
a cricket
fantastic, and it's great to see the tennis courts redone
Team. Yeah, being
now.
redone. Yeah.
Can I just add an anecdote, or a family thing that sticks out in my mind of how different life was back, years ago. My dad, after he came back from the war, in 1948, he had a bad accident, snigging logs with a horse when they were cutting down the timber on the place. A log came loose and jammed his leg between two logs. It tore muscle off the back of his leg. There was no ambulance, no medical attention immediately available like everybody expects these days. I presume his father brought him home from over the bush, and they bandaged it up. Maybe someone locally took them to Healesville.
Yeah, his cousin's husband. Carried him to Hillsville.
Yeah, actually drove him to Hillsville in
Had
a
a
car because his father didn't drive, never had a car. And then later in the evening, his future brother-in-law actually drove him all the way to Melbourne Hospital to get treatment. And they thought at first initially he was going to lose his leg because it had taken so long to, do it. But they were able to patch it up, and he was 10 weeks in hospital. But just there's such a contrast now to medical attention and ambulances, and no matter where you are in Victoria, you can get an ambulance within a reasonable time, and all of that was just you just didn't expect that in those days.
Can I just ask, were there any memorable individuals or families in Toolangi that you'd just like to mention? You've mentioned a number of them.
Oh look, there was a core of families back in early in the 1880s and 90s that are still here. There's the Denbys were related to one of the early settlers. There was 3 Lawrence brothers, and Ross and Gary Denby, their grandmother, she married a Lawrence. There was Priestley's.
Yeah.
There's Bernard's still around today. The Bassetts aren't here anymore. McLean's are still around.
Yeah.
There's no McNulty's. They came in the 30s. They were around for years. Who else was there? There's still rumours of Cherries.
Yeah.
And there was Heather McClement still lives here. And her cousin Dennis lives in Hillsville.
That's right, and she's a Lawrence.
She was related to the Lawrences as well. That's right. Yeah,
and Heather, are there any memorable characters that stick in your mind?
Well, I suppose because we knew them a bit more, but my 2 uncles, well, we called them uncles, Tom and Jack Biggs, were kind of, I suppose in a way you term them, it sounds a bit derogatory, the hillbillies in a way, the way they lived.
They were cousins.
No, they were brothers.
Yeah,
those
they
two
were
brothers.
They were cousins
they were our father's first
cousins.
So
they lived
bachelors.
Bachelors lived on the farm, ran dairy cows and
pretty eccentric.
Whatever. And,
well, one fiddled with bees, and his uncle came up to Toolangi one day, and Jack had been out putting lime on for the horses, and he had a couple of weeks' growth on his face, and his uncle come round, he come back, he said, I'm over there, he said, I walk around the corner, and my God, he said, oh, here's come Sinbad.
His what?
Here comes Sinbad, the sailor man. It was his nephew. He had this big bit of beard, and it was all white from the lime.
So they were real characters.
They were.
Yeah, and the house, his father had built the house when this my grandfather's brother, built the house, and they never painted it, and they lived in it until Jack actually left the property when he was 80.
Smith's Road, it is.
Smith's Road.
Still there,
Last,
still hasn't fell a bit.
You've seen a lot of major changes, and you've talked about them, particularly the electricity coming on. You've talked about the pub, and you've talked about the one shop. What about major changes that you've observed in the area?
Well, it's opened up a bit. There was a bit of land clearing in the 60s. We were school kids. There hasn't been a great lot more opened up since probably 1970 onwards. It's relatively like it is, but there's been a few small blocks cut up. It's as my grandfather said, a bit of new blood come into the place, but whether it's been welcome or not is another matter. Some of it, but that's progress. There's probably less people around Toolangi now than when we were kids.
Less
because in those days there was more people
working in the mills.
Yes. And potato research. Look, the mid-70s there was still a fair number because you had the potato research and the farm that had been opened up became a bulb farm, so that was employed quite a number.
More people living down Castella now, I suppose.
There is in those housing estates, small rural living.
I think probably the biggest change that I would say is the transition from growing potatoes to strawberries. The strawberry growing became a huge change, and basically the area transitioned out of growing potatoes because that was the main
from potatoes
agricultural
to
activity
yeah.
here.
Shoot, yeah.
Now there's, I don't think anybody grows potatoes here anymore,
No,
do
they
they?
don't.
Mostly Kinglake now.
Well, no, I've only got one grower left in Kinglake I buy from.
But yeah, all transition to this transition to the strawberries.
Strawberries.
That's been a huge change.
Um,
I think the scaling down in the timber logging, that's had a huge effect on the community.
The demographics, how it's changed. Yeah.
And you see the pub burnt down in '75, and things were, that was a
But the tavern
bit
opened
of
up.
a central thing, and then the tavern opened in, was it 206? There was there was a shop built over there, replaced the Kelly's one for a few years, and then they ambitious and built the tavern there, and it operated till, what are we now, 21? It operated till 12, 18 months ago.
Very last question. What's special about Talangi for each of you?
Oh, to me, I think it's probably the whole connection. This is where I lived from when I was from all my childhood. Went to Melbourne to do studies and work, but always came back home at weekends until I married and left the district in 1982. But didn't move far away, so always had that same connection. But I think probably more the environment is what's special to me, particularly now not living up here this way. To come back to the mountains and the gum trees and I used, as a kid, used to love going. Probably my outdoor activity was wandering off down to the creek down in the bottom of here and with the dogs and just having a wander through the great big high bracken fern and tree ferns and all that sort of stuff. That was great. And just to come back now to the bush, that's what I love.
Now, there was just one other thing that you'd mentioned in informal talks was about the difference in education and educational opportunities.
Yeah, I feel we're really privileged that when we were due for secondary school, that the high school in Hills was started, so we could so easily go and get secondary education. In my father's day, they generally would only go to grade 8, which was the equivalent of year 8 in secondary schooling. Then they just went to work. Probably a lot finished before then, went straight to work. And only two of them, my father's generation, was himself and his cousin, who actually won scholarships to be able to go to Melbourne. Dad went to Melbourne Technical School for 2 years to get training, and then through that he got a job at with the SEC as a storeman. Probably very fortunate that was then at the start of the Depression years, and he held that job until he enlisted in the army.
And it was a government scholarship?
Yes, a government scholarship. Otherwise, they just people didn't have the opportunities to get education.
And if they went down to, say, Footscray Tech or Melbourne Tech?
You had to have relatives to go and to be able to live with, or good friends that could
so they
house
live with
you.
relatives?
Yeah.
Live with relatives or friends, yes. Yeah, that's right.
Very, very different world.
Yeah.
Different world.
Other than, I suppose, the contrast then, all those ones of our generation, they're a little bit older than us, who actually had to ride a push bike and catch a bus and then go to Yea or go to Lilydale, which is quite a distance. But in our generation, we were very fortunate to then have all those educational opportunities open up.
And you asked, I thought Talangi is special. It's home. It's 70 years to me. I took on the farm here plus the businesses, and always enjoyed it at night, no matter how tired I was coming home in the truck after carting spuds and buying and selling, to head back to the hills because you could hop out of the truck and
I understand that.
it was home better for an hour and wake up the next morning, the paddocks and the space.
And the magic out there.
Yeah, well, it's and you could see the weather coming in or going. What was the change of weather patterns and what was, look down the valley for nice clear mornings and
you
nothing better.
Seasons and you're aware of them.
There's nothing you can enjoy of a cold frosty morning up here. The sun's out and you can look down the valley and it's a sea of cloud. Talangi does have its bad days in the winter with its fog, but that's you've got to make the most of the enjoyable ones.
Jeff and Heather, I've got to really thank you for the interview, and you've given us a real insight into what life's been like across 6 generations and the changes, and that's wonderful.